Thank you. All right, go ahead, Dave.
All right, thanks, Darcy. So I'm going to try to juggle two things at once here, so bear with me. So we are, like the rest of the talks, a group talk brought to you by an aquatic ecologist, a water resource engineer, a hydrologist, and a restoration ecologist. So we hope to do this topic justice. It's a big topic, and so we do our best, but we're certainly ready and willing for your critiques and your thoughts and so on in our questions afterwards and also later on and also after that. So anyway, so we're talking about this topic, again, linking restoration design alternatives with functional fish habitat in tidal wetlands. So we'll jump into some takeaways just to kind of orient you guys with what we sort of plan to talk about. So as you may know, restoration design over the last 20 or 30 years has evolved a lot in the Bay Delta. And now, increasingly so, there's various numerical models that can help assist with restoration design. And this is really exciting because it provides more sort of direct opportunities for scientists, restoration practitioners, managers, and so on to sort of collaborate together to design these things. Also, I'll point out at the top of the screen, if you sort of get lost in the soup, those are the sort of broad categories. We'll talk about the background, wetland morphology, numerical models, implementing restoration, and then we'll summarize things as well. We'll start by sort of like what are our goals when we talk about designing wetland restoration sites. So ideally, we would have sort of a predictive knowledge that we could use to design and construct wetlands that sort of reach our goals of sustaining natural fish populations as well as other species as well. And so I guess one thing I'll point out here too, these are direct excerpts from some papers. Did that in order to sort of shed some light on some important work that's been done over the years to discuss this topic. Often it feels like people don't think there are many papers written on this topic within the Bay Delta estuary, and I would argue there is. And so kind of referencing back to some of that work. Secondly, we need to balance the benefits to target species with the cost of implementing the action. It's a non-trivial cost to restore these tidal wetlands, so that's important. And so like our sort of panel here, the folks that put together this talk, we think it's important to have ecologists working with hydrologists, engineers, managers, and so on to sort of help optimize the outcome of these of our design. As you Stacy kind of alluded to earlier, restoration began, over 30 years ago within the Bay Delta estuary. And a lot of those initial restoration sites lacked a lot of physical complexity and features, and perhaps in some cases lacked biological diversity as a result. Probably the most, something that really epitomized that is the breaching of levees, which was conceived as this really inexpensive way to increase the amount of shallow water habitat, i.e. tidal wetlands. And it's been a while. It's been about 25 years since the quote on the bottom was released, basically thinking that reflooded islands, things like Liberty Island or Little Holland Track, places like that might promote the recovery of native fish species. So this is not a fish talk. We won't talk much about that directly, but stay tuned for the fish talk next. There'll be some insights into that 25 years on. All right, so as I've kind of alluded to, over the course of time, there's been some lessons learned. One is that restoration practitioners have sort of acknowledged that the lack of complexity sort of constrains the ultimate output of wetlands to some degree. And there's been sort of a consensus that dendritic tidal systems provide more sort of complex habitat and may better support wetland functions. And lastly, it's important to sort of look at the past, things like SFEI documents that have done a really good job of characterizing what the historical delta looked like and sort of mimic those historical landforms to better support native species recovery. It's important to keep in mind many of these fish evolved in that system, and so restoring to something similar might be the best approach. All right, in keeping with the idea that there is actually a lot of literature that's been sort of published on this topic. On the right there's several sort of design sort of guidelines that provide some insights into, pretty detailed insights into restoration design. And on the bottom there is the Delta Renewed, which again provides some sort of bullet points for various across various topics, including restoration design. So shown there in the blue box are some sort of rules of thumb about how restoration designers might, considerations they might include in their designs. Okay, so what if you include all of those sort of consideration, those rules of thumb? Well, what we know is it's really expensive to restore tidal marshes. It's really expensive to move earth. So, even if you kind of implement all of those rules of thumb, there's various different ways to carry that out, various different configurations, as shown on the bottom of the slide there. And so if you have 40 acres, as in the example there, how might you sort of configure that? And it's really important to think about the marginal cost and benefits of doing so. And so how do you do that? Let's shift gears here. Actually, before we get to that, it's important to acknowledge that not every sort of design that might be best for fish is available to us because of various considerations like landowner concerns, salinity intrusion, tidal prism, things of that nature. In reality, those constrain sort of the pool of restoration options that are available to us. But having said that, there are several kind of alternatives that would sort of pass muster in terms of those concerns. And so how would you compare those two, shown here on the left? It's really expensive to build these restoration sites, as I've mentioned. It takes a long time, lots of permitting. There's various levels to all of this, as you all know. So one way we think could be increasingly useful is to use numerical modeling, sort of, a lot of sort of feasibility models are currently used in terms of salinity intrusion and tidal energy and so on and so forth. But we think those could be complemented with ecological models, which we lay out here in terms of like what we actually care about: fish food, fish habitat, and hydrodynamic exchange. That's really sort of simplified, but I think it helps to orient us to the sort of end products that we hope for. So within those three topics, we'll be talking about primary production in green, fish habitat availability in gray, and water residence time. There'll be three of us. I'll be talking about fish habitat, and Paul will be talking about the other two. And we're ultimately interested in how things like the wetland landform, shown there in brown, can interact with hydrodynamics to sort of propagate across those levels and affect those things. All right, so in terms of fish habitat, we know that water depth is an important parameter in habitat suitability indices. You guys may have seen this with things like salmon life cycle models. There's a certain depth range that's associated with rearing. And so, depth is important because that's related to things like foraging behavior, predator avoidance, and also maybe photic depth in primary production conditions. And so this map here comes from SFEI, and it's an effort to sort of quantify and sort of determine where in space these rearing habitats might exist. And so that's really helpful in sort of orienting us broadly to where those habitats might be. But that's just sort of a daily snapshot at mean high water. So as you know, tidal wetlands are extremely dynamic and they're shallow. And so, that's kind of limited if you're only looking at a once daily depth. So kind of shifting gears here, as you may know, a lot of tidal wetland rearing fishes, like juvenile Chinook salmon, they are thought to sort of move tidally to stay in a sort of shallow preferred depth range. So if that's the case, they may be moving across the landscape with the tides. And so what you see here is two different adjacent wetlands located in the Cache Slough complex that are adjacent but very different landforms. And so that is a water level model for those two sites, and it's binned across those different habitat categories that mostly corresponds with known sort of rearing habitat within the system. And a couple things to point out here. So the last slide showed habitat location. That's important, but this allows us we can estimate the quantity and spatial proximity of rearing habitat by integrating water depth across space and time. And so that allows us to have this sort of apples to apples comparison in terms of how much shallow habitat is there across space and time at both of these sites. So you'll see on the right, there's a lot of shallow habitat there, 92%. But the sort of median intertidal migration distance to maintain occupancy within that shallow sort of rearing range, it's like 74 meters. And so the other site has a lot, has less shallow habitat, but less sort of shorter migration distances. So it's important to kind of consider both availability and accessibility as we think about fish habitat. And so with that, I'll shift over to Paul here, who will tell you about his modeling approaches.
Thanks, Dave. As Dave alluded to, we have a few different models or tools we can use to assess restoration designs. So I'll be talking about specifically hydrodynamic exchange and then primary productivity. And what's most important is how the landscape interacts with the tides, with the water flow. And hopefully we can develop some tools that can allow us to leverage the tides by constructing these tidal wetlands to have desirable biological outcomes. So the first tool I'm going to talk about is hydrodynamic exchange. Blind channels are an important feature in both the historic and contemporary delta because these channels create gradients in physical, chemical, and biological parameters. And we use the ratio of the tidal excursion to channel length to come up with reasonable predictions of these gradients. And these, the exchange, is, like I said, is governed by the morphology of either the blind channel or the tidal marsh systems. So this example is from the Cache Slough complex. The figure on the left shows hydrodynamic exchange. This is from a 1D model that's constrained by the tidal excursion. So that the colors there show concentration gradients, which is analogous to residence time. As you can see, the residence time figure on the right closely matches the modeled exchange in these channels. Furthermore, species richness, defined by the unique number of pelagic fish, is generally higher in these higher residence time areas. So while this model shows residence time or hydrodynamic exchange in these blind channels, we can also apply this model to tidal marsh systems as well. This example is from First Mallard Branch in Suisun Marsh, which is a natural tidal wetland. The marsh plain inundates from the channels on a periodic basis that changes from fortnightly to monthly timescales, typically happening more frequently in the summer than the winter and fall months. The figure in the middle, I guess, shows what the concentration gradient looks like on the neap tide, where you have very high residence time water in most of the upper part of the channel. And what happens on the spring tide is the marsh plain overtops and these channels flush out, and you get lower residence time in the upper part of the channels. So you're getting this periodic isolation and flushing of the channels. So next, to take it a little step further, Steve Andrews at RMA developed a numerical model that explicitly models water exchange, nitrogen, phytoplankton, and zooplankton concentrations. And while this is kind of a generic marsh, it was roughly calibrated for First Mallard Branch. And the basic results of this model show similar to what we were seeing in the field, where you get higher residence time water in the upper channels on the neap tides, and then on the spring tides, you get flushing and export. So this model, like I said, was roughly calibrated for First Mallard Branch, but it hasn't been rigorously calibrated and validated. But with a model like this, we can look at things like if we change the marsh design, if it's in a fluvial system versus tidal system, if we change the size, the spacing of the marshes, the shape of the marsh, marsh plain elevations, how do all these things affect primary productivity? And we found that these different scenarios or restoration designs can have either small or pretty significant outcomes on the production within the marsh system and the export out of the marsh. So the next steps for this primary production modeling is we need to calibrate it and validate it. That's an important process. There hasn't been a lot of data collected explicitly to calibrate this type of model, but we're hoping we can use data that already exists, and in some cases we might need to have targeted field data collection specifically for model calibration. And what's also important is that phytoplankton-based production is only one part of the lower food web. And we recognize that detritus makes up a pretty significant portion of that food web. So ideally, we would like to incorporate a model that includes the whole suite of lower food web in this type of modeling efforts. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ramona.
Thank you. So I just got the clue here. So as you probably gathered from our presentations here, opportunities to restore tidal wetlands are both precious and pricey. So we want to make sure we make the best of these opportunities. And in order to do that, we want to take the best science that has been evolving and apply that to the design of projects. So there's a lot of considerations that go into design because it's both complex, that's the way ecology is, and complicated. I've just listed several of these that we might have to consider, starting with ecological. How are these sites going to meet their goals of improving habitat quality and quantity, both for our desired fish species such as juvenile salmonids, and also multi-species benefits, and also avoiding impacts to other little critters like this cute little salt marsh harvest mouse, and not exacerbating conditions with invasive species. But there's a lot of other considerations that go into it. A designer has to think about what are the flood ramifications for breaching this wetland. How do you avoid raising flood stage or having hydraulic impacts in the channels that might scour adjacent levees? There's also water supply considerations, both the quality and the quantity of water available for agricultural and municipal supply. And you have to think about the feasibility and cost effectiveness. Moving dirt is expensive. So how can you optimize that and consider dealing with the sites that are often subsided and then getting the project permitted? In addition, you may have other goals related to public use opportunities, as well as public health considerations of avoiding algal blooms or concerns about mosquitoes. So to kind of illustrate this conversation, I'm using an example from another eco-restore project done by DWR, the Dutch Slough Restoration Project. These were the main goals that they had. The idea, starting back when the property was acquired 20 years ago, 2003, it was viewed as an area to try to restore ecological processes, and through that, to reestablish historic habitats to benefit native species, particularly juvenile salmonids, as well as Sacramento splittail, and other species there such as rails and giant garter snake. In addition, they want to provide shoreline access, recreation opportunities, and a future park for the city of Oakley. But most importantly, this was viewed as an opportunity for adaptive management. How can we learn about this and pay this knowledge forward into future restoration? So the idea was to test different restoration approaches and use monitoring to evaluate that. So the project was designed in a phased way. This is the 3 parcels that were part of the Dutch Slough property. The 2 on the left, Emerson and Gilbert, were the first phase of restoration. And some of the considerations that you had to deal with here was a lot of the areas were subsided to the north. How do you deal with raising that? what kind of appropriate elevations to establish marsh, and how might fish use these marsh areas. So the design that was implemented, some of the considerations that went into that were for tidal channels, what kind of sinuosity patterns. And the designers, including my colleague Mark Lindley, who helped me with this presentation, looked at historical ecology in the Delta, as well as lessons learned from San Francisco Bay and reference sites to come up with the sinuosity patterns. They also used hydraulic geometry to try to look at what sort of patterns in the marsh channels to develop, using surveys of historical delta marshes and other reference sites. And part of that, they came up with several design patterns for different sizes of channels. And finally, looking at tidal marsh, what kind of elevations to establish low marsh in the light green and mid marsh in the dark green, as well as higher areas along the channel berms for high marsh and riparian. So construction on this site started in 2018. The site was planted in 2020, and in fall 2021, 5 breaches were made around that to reestablish restoration, to reestablish tidal connectivity. Design is going on now for the Burroughs parcel as a phase 2, and some of the considerations here, and this is a picture from the middle parcel there, are how do you, again, dealing with the earthwork. It's highly expensive. That first phase, they had to move 2.3 million cubic yards of earth. So how can we balance a cut and fill and make it cost effective? Do we need to look again at the marsh elevations, given what we're seeing on this new first phase? And how will things, accrete in the marsh? Will vegetation keep up with sea level rise? The other is what kind of topography, maintaining complexity so you can have a more diverse mosaic of habitats, revegetation performance, and other considerations that cropped up. One in particular is seepage. As you increase water elevations on these restored sites, sometimes there may be seepage to adjoining properties. So you may have to build in cutoff walls to protect that and provide flood protection. So there are going to be engineering levees to replace some of these ag levees on the Burroughs parcel to protect the residential areas to the south. As I've been listening to the talks and thinking about these tools, we think about the performance and how can we make these things better. And one of the major drivers was fish habitat. So there's still some questions about fish. How might they use these habitats that have been restored? How might they move in, move out on the different tidal cycles? So there's still a lot to learn, and this is just an example of one of the places where maybe we can gather that data to improve our models and improve our design. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Dave.
All right, thanks, Paul and Ramona. So we'll sort of cap things off here by talking about adaptive management using ecological models. Again, that kind of encompasses the fish habitat model, the primary production model, and the water residence time model. And so I think there's an opportunity, we can all agree, to improve design. And we sort of think about that here. Let's look at these 3 figures on the bottom. So the one on the right is actually what Dutch Slough looks like when it was constructed. But as a thought experiment, we experimentally stripped off channels there in the 3 examples. And so you could, in the future, design several different restoration sites that sort of meet the standards as far as feasibility. And then you could sort of help select those by looking at optimizing things like habitat opportunity and production potential, those benefits, versus excavation cost and tidal energy cost. It's important to point out that when you build one of these things, that has an effect on the total tidal energy in the system, which Paul could and others could speak to. And so then ideally, we would do this kind of, in step and have information available for phased implementation. So we can monitor these build examples and apply lessons learned from early phases to improve the design of future restoration sites. And, it's important to point out that modeling, the model is only as good as a validation, and modeling itself can bring up some uncertainties as well. And so we're sort of forthright about that and think it's important to reduce modeling uncertainties with some priority studies is laid out here. And so real quickly, this sort of follows the opportunity, capacity, and realized function. So the first question that we think we could help answer and also improve our models is, how are fish using restored wetland habitats? One way to go about that would be to acoustically tag and track fish movement, and also their depth use patterns to sort of validate what I showed earlier with the fish habitat model. And we could do that using things like rearing Chinook salmon. Secondly, how does channel and marsh configuration affect hydrodynamic exchange and food production and export? We could improve our predictive models, as Paul pointed out, using field validation data across space and time. And lastly, in terms of realized function, it's great if these models are robust, but do they actually predict things like realized function? Are there correlations between ecological model outputs and desirable fish communities? And so we could leverage fish monitoring data that already exist to maybe explore the link between habitat opportunity and realized function. And ultimately, we think that can help to sort of manage the many trade-offs that are above and beyond what our models are capable of assessing, but perhaps they can get us closer to something that is more considerate of these different things. All right, so the takeaways, kind of reading this off again. So restoration design has evolved in the Bay Delta over the decades, and simple channel networks and flooded islands have largely been sort of replaced in the design realm with more dendritic channel networks. Various ecological models can now assist with restoration design. So ecological models that we presented, plus the feasibility models that are used to assess salinity intrusion and those types of things, together can probably provide a more holistic restoration design. And then lastly, and really importantly, we think this can lead to an increased opportunity for scientists and restoration practitioners to collaborate and sort of maximize the ecological benefits of the remaining opportunities to restore these habitats. And with that, we'd like to thank our funding sources, the Delta Science Program, state water contractors, and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, along with data collection by various different USGS groups, land access by Rush Ranch, Wildlands, and individual support. Mark Lindley should be up there, and probably others, and Jesse Schroeder, and so on. And we left our references here in case anyone's interested in sort of following up. And with that, we can take any questions. And forgot to actually introduce everyone taking part here. So let's do that really quickly. So again, I'm Dave Ayers. I'm a graduate student at UC Davis. Steve Andrews is a engineer at Resource Management Associates, and Paul Stumpner, hydrologist at USGS, and Ramona Swenson, a restoration ecologist at ESA. And with that, we'll take any questions.
I'm going to ask a question from online first while people are thinking in the room. So, Dave, since you're at the podium, are you going to overlay your in-depth or your depth-mediated predation study findings on top of the numerical models to make inferences, not only about migration distance, but also predation risk across different marsh configurations?
Yeah, good question. And I guess the short answer is yes. There is some correlation between predation in marshes and depth categories that kind of tracks with the rearing kind of ranges. And so, yes, I'm certainly exploring how to do that to sort of validate, that these rearing depths do indeed sort of have an effect in reality, both from the literature and using that field study to help sort of validate that those depth ranges are indeed useful.
Okay. Great. So here's another one that just came in, and I don't know what this is, so sorry. But do you take invasion by IAPs into account in the design?
Yeah, that's one concern about aquatic vegetation into all the projects that we've been looking at. I've not been doing the design as Mark Lindley has been on Dutch Slough, but I know on several other projects we do try to factor that in terms of thinking about depths. But the challenge is some of the depths that you might need to discourage aquatic vegetation are pretty deep. And so trying to balance that with providing nearshore, shallow habitat for fish. So there's no simple answer there, but we are trying to factor that in.
All right, thanks, Ramona. Any questions in the room?
Thanks, everyone. So Dave introduced this idea of phased implementation and taking monitoring results from early phases to carry them forward to later phases. And I just noted that the Dutch Slough example that you talked about, Ramona, was phased implementation. And I'm wondering if there were any opportunities reflecting back for doing this approach that Dave talked about, or if that happened in the Dutch Slough project. And I know there's others in the room that are really involved with Dutch Slough, so okay to refer the question if you would like to.
Yeah, I saw Katie Bandy here, and so I don't want to speak too out of turn, but I know when talking with Mark about these questions about design, I mean, one challenge is that sometimes the project, the phases get kind of collapsed and the timing may vary. So it's sometimes hard to get the performance of the first phase into the next. But nevertheless, I think just from the process of that, Mark mentioned, understanding what fish may do in these projects and how they may use those, and new questions that emerge like, okay, what happens if they're flushed out into the channels and might they be vulnerable to predation there? But yeah, trying to close that loop on adaptive management from those first phases into the next. And sometimes you have to pay that forward to your next project. But I don't know if there can be additional that others more knowledgeable might want to add.
We'll be talking about this a lot in the afternoon session.
Stay tuned for the afternoon. More shall be revealed.
Another quick question about Dutch Slough. Somebody asked what agency is responsible for the restoration project, what kind of monitoring is going on, and who is funding it, who is conducting it. So I don't know if you want to just do a quick.
Okay, DWR was the principal sponsor. There was cooperation from the Reclamation District, 2167, I believe, and many partners involved with that. I'm going to be getting ahead of my skis to try to get this, but I know it was a lot of partners, a lot of expense, and stay tuned because I believe the managers in the back will be providing a little more detail unless they wish to answer it right now.
That's probably a longer answer than especially like who's funding all the research. DWR that we working with RD 2137.
RD 2137 and DWR is the principal funder and manager.
Yeah, we have various funding sources for
Yeah, and she's saying various funding sources, and it's a long answer, so we'll get into it a little bit more later. All right. Okay, there's a lot of questions here. So let's see. Do you see a difference between floodplain and tidal habitat in your work? How are you looking at that for benefits to fish species?
Okay, so the question about benefits of floodplain use and tidal marsh, and I think it depends on the species, and that's often a challenge. We know it's been well documented for juvenile salmonids, the use of intermittently flooded seasonal wetlands on floodplains as they're migrating out. And that's particularly important on perhaps some of the perimeter of the delta. But we also are trying to design things where tidal wetlands may provide benefits. So I think it's knowing what species and what life stage and what time of year you're trying to provide benefits for is important. But perhaps most importantly is working with what you got. If your site is deeply subsided, then you're not going to be looking at floodplain opportunities. If your site is a little higher, then maybe you have an opportunity to bring tide flood water on, but only seasonally. So I guess the answer is it depends.
Great. All right. Questions in the room? I'm not running, sorry. My knees are too old.
Hi, this might be a question more for Paul. Are there opportunities for using gates to manipulate the water level beyond what the tides are actually doing as a way to supplement moving Earth around?
Yeah, I believe so. But I think we can also be a little more intelligent on designs to leverage the tide, so we don't have to go that route.
All right. Ramona or Dave? No follow-ups?
Can I mention something real quick?
Yep.
So there could be, opportunities for, gates that were built in initially that could be used to sort of experimentally open or close a given channel, and that would allow us to help manage and validate production models and stuff like that. So it's really hard to do adaptive management after it's built, but if you think about those things in advance, that's maybe something that could be done.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. We're going to end this session. Thank you, guys. Big round of applause for this session. And then we will move on to the next session. So, Eddie.
All right, good morning. This is Ed Ehard with the California State Parks Division of Boating and Waterways. I'm the branch chief for the Aquatic Invasive Species Unit within Division of Boating and Waterways. And today we're going to kind of change it up a little bit after what we've heard. We've heard about physical habitat, zooplankton, and the invertebrates, and we just heard about restoration design. So what we're going to talk about now is what we kind of heard towards the end of this last session, invasive species, in particular aquatic invasive plants. And with us today is Tom McNabb, who's the president and CEO of Clean Lakes Incorporated, Dr. John Madsen, USDA Ag Research Service, retired research scientist, and Mr. Jeffrey Caudill, Senior Environmental Scientist, Supervisory Program Manager for the Aquatic Invasive Species or Aquatic Invasive Plant Program at Boating. So today, what we're going to do is address invasive species, particularly for the aquatic plants and their management in the Delta. Integrated pest management, the programs, the goals, the research, and the global experience that Tom in particular can bring. We've had 40 years this year of doing aquatic invasive plant management in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Bay Delta. And it's been a challenge. We've got some lessons learned that we want to perhaps touch on, some future opportunities, and some observations about controlling these species, in particular, through adaptive management and collaboration. So first, let's have Jeff go ahead.
Is this it? Okay. Good morning, everyone. And thanks for your time today. Thanks for giving us an opportunity to talk a little more about IAP, which was brought up in the previous question session, invasive aquatic plants. So aquatic invasive plant management in the Delta has been ongoing for about 40 years. I'm going to talk a little about the program that's under the California Department of Parks and Recreation, Division of Boating and Waterways, that has been implemented for the last 40 years. A little bit about some studies that we have been a part of or conducted. And then we're going to move on to Dr. John Madsen, who will talk more about herbicides and vegetation control in the California Delta, and then we can take questions after that. Thank you. Just figuring out the controls. Thank you. So real quick, for the talk that I'll give here for a little bit, we'll talk about the program. As I had mentioned before, the study we had conducted in Frank's Tract between the years 2006 to 2018, along with our involvement with the Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy study, where we work with DWR and several other kind of collaborators on work in the central and northern Delta. So a quick overview of our program. So we are the lead agency in the California Delta and Suisun Marsh for aquatic invasive plant management. That would be north to the I Street Bridge in Sacramento, down to the Friant Dam and out to the Cashflow Complex currently, with goals of moving into Suisun Marsh. And this is a map of kind of our control area as you see it today. Harbors and Navigation Code 64 and 64.5 are the regulations that provide us with the lead agency status, along with what kind of plants that we are allowed to control. We have regulations that started with Congress, with Senate bills and Assembly bills that have added to our current 10 plant invasive species that we currently control for, which has moved from legislative to working with a risk assessment process with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And they would work with their collaborators, researchers, and stakeholders to determine if new plants should be added to our program as target aquatic invasive plants that we have to manage. We manage the plants per the regulations for the benefit of the economy, the environment, and the public health. And for the purposes of today's talk, we also talk about some of the benefits that we can add to restoration and just control within the Delta for the water users, the environmental kind of needs, wants, and requirements. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about adaptive management and integrated pest management with our program. When the program first started, based on the resources that were allowed, it was primarily herbicides with no other options really readily available. And we moved from not having many monitoring tools and having very limited even herbicides to adding to that in order to add physical controls, biocontrols, mechanical controls, also adding monitoring, which would go beyond, say, visually inspecting sites or complaint calls or anything else. So I mentioned I was going to talk about one of the studies that we had published. So Frank's Tract is a 3,500 water acre site in the Southern Delta. And throughout those years, starting in 2006, we had started a long-term treatment program. We used the herbicide fluoridone. Its use is controlling submersed aquatic vegetation, or SAV. The target at that time was Aguirrea densa, or Brazilian waterweed, which is one of the main SAV species that we have to handle, and it's pretty detrimental to a lot of the work on restoration, the fishes we've talked about, site management, and water managers within the Delta. And we had used that product to treat from 2006 through 2018, and I'll talk a little more about that. I've got some materials and methods here. Again, fluoridone was used. We're going to use it for 8 to 16 weeks kind of at a time. We'll call it per treatment phase, and some years there might be 2 treatment phases. This is a systemic herbicide, which you have to keep a certain water level concentration in order for this to be effective. And in a moving estuary and tidal influenced area like the Delta, that's a very, very challenging ask. And it takes a lot of effort and a lot of resources to be able to maintain that. And we want to show you kind of what the results were. Bottom line, the results of this study over the 12 years we were looking at it, we saw a decrease in invasive vegetation at 100 different rake points that we had throughout the Frank's Tract site. We saw an increase in native vegetation, and we went from the most dominant abundant species of Aguirrea densa in 2006 to the most abundant and a dominant species being Richardson's pondweed, which is a native plant instead of an invasive plant. So the chart that I have here just shows a lot of the rake point data we have and whether you're going to see invasive plants, which are the blue, native plants, which are the green. I'll note that due to resource constraints, there's data here in 2006 and 2007, and then the data didn't pick up again until 2013. And so there is a gap in data. However, when you look at the stretch of time and what the data show between 2007 and 2013, you don't see a huge difference in terms of the plants being native or invasive at the different rake points. Everything was looked at in terms of presence and absence, along with abundance on that rake, which allows us to see SAV, submersed aquatic vegetation. And that was done in order to kind of monitor what's being done in our sites. It's very difficult to go into many sites in the Delta and look straight down and see what you're looking at. And so this helps too, because many of the sites that we manage throughout the Delta, there are native and invasive plants. And so in order to make sure that we are targeting the invasive plants and the correct invasive plant, we want to make sure that we conduct these monitoring studies and surveys to find out what's down below, and we report that in our annual reports as well. So these are just more charts that talk about the findings throughout the years when we had the data. So this is a study that I can provide to anyone. It's a peer-reviewed manuscript for anyone that may be interested. But this is just more of the data that you can find in the study that talked about what plants we had found, how many, were they native, were they invasive, the abundance, and so on and so forth, with the idea just to show that over a period of time, this was a successful site where we were able to utilize herbicide, and we were able to see a species change between mostly invasive plants in this Franks Tract area to mostly native plants, where they were also the most abundant. So one would argue that this is a success story that the program has had over the long term using this one particular herbicide. One thing I want to note too, before I move on to this Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy study that we were partnered with DWR with, at the time these studies were being conducted, we had approval for one herbicide to be used on submerged aquatic vegetation, and that was fluoridone. Again, in a tidally influenced area, using a concentration required, or an herbicide that requires you to maintain a concentration of chemical is a very challenging ask. There are places where you might find success, but there are also many places you might find that this is not the right tool to be managed. And so in the North and Central Delta, we looked at a control site, and we looked at an experimental site. So we treated Little Hastings Tract and Decker Island as our experimental sites. And the data over the 3 years that we had done treatments shows that you didn't really see an effect. These sites, mostly say northern or western Delta, are more tidally influenced, higher flows, very challenging sites that we've had to try and keep the concentration of the fluoridone in it to actually have an impact that we were looking for, which is either the reduction of invasive species or the control or eradication of these endangered invasive species, excuse me. This is for the endangered species. But this is also a study to show that a one-size-fits-all approach is not a successful recipe for managing aquatic invasive plants in the Delta. Luckily, since all of these studies have been conducted and reported, we actually have several other contact herbicides now that we use for submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, that have been much more successful with kind of a lower resource profile that's required. And so I just wanted to point out some of the studies that we've had that shows that we have had some success with some of these tools, but more kind of adaptive management is going to be needed in order to successfully manage aquatic invasive vegetation, along with all of the different folks in this room and outside whom we work with and collaborate with to try and find success. And so I've got some contact information up there, but I'd like to hand it over to Dr. John Manson, who's going to talk more about managing vegetation in the Delta with herbicides.
Thank you, Jeffrey. So I acknowledge that I may well be poking the golden bear, but if you want to send me some hate email, I will. There's my email address at the bottom, and I also have a card of sort that I can give you that has my email address on it. Okay, anyway, I'm going to talk about managing aquatic vegetation in the Delta. I'm really kind of talking about aquatic plant management in general, then talking about it in the Delta, and then talking a little bit about aquatic plant management in the context of restoration. And I will try and stay focused here. That's a problem when you get to be retired, is you start going off on tangents. But there are 16 active ingredients that are labeled for aquatic use by the US EPA. And I'm going on a tangent already. The amazing thing is half of those have been labeled since the year 2000. Okay, so we're getting more aquatic herbicides, and I'm hopeful that we can actually get a few more, and why that would be, you'll find out maybe a little later. Only 8 of these are labeled for use by California Department of Pesticide Regulation. It isn't that the other 8 are not safe for California use. It's that California requires additional requirements to get a label, And companies, for reasons of their own, like they don't want to spend the money, California's a small market for aquatic plant management, they don't get the label. 7 have been approved for use in the Delta by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. National Marine Fisheries Service, but with many restrictions. And then lastly, for the foliar applications to floating and emergent plants, we require an approved surfactant to be added to that because aquatic herbicides do not include a surfactant, unlike many terrestrial herbicides. Okay, which herbicide to use? We have to first understand plant susceptibility because every species is not susceptible to every herbicide, which is good and bad. The good part is that we can get some selectivity then. We have to see that it's compatible with the proposed use because there's restrictions on water for drinking, livestock drinking, irrigation, and so on. Water use restrictions. There's a whole question of selectivity. We want to target the target plant, the non-native plant, and leave the native plants in many situations. And then we have to understand this whole concept of concentration exposure time for submersed applications. Selective control. There's a misapprehension that if you use an herbicide in water, you're going to kill everything. And it's just not the case. This is actually from the 90s. They did science back then. I know it's shocking to find that out. But this is my colleague, Kurt Getzinger. On the left is a tank before treatment, before treatment. It's planted with several different native species and with Eurasian water milfoil. And then the right tank is 4 weeks after treatment with an oxinic herbicide, in this case triclopyr. And it's controlled Eurasian water milfoil, and the native plants are released from competition from the canopy of milfoil and are growing, and they're quite content if plants have a feeling of contentment. I mentioned concentration exposure time. This is harder to explain than it looks, but basically for each herbicide and species, there'll be a profile of how long exposure time you require at a given concentration. So this is for triclopyr again and Eurasian water milfoil. The full label rate is 2.5 milligrams per liter, or ppm if you prefer. And at 2.5, we can get 100% control at about 18 hours, if I can see that from this angle. But if we have, say, 36 hours of exposure time, a place where there's not a lot of water exchange, we can get control with 1 milligram per liter of triclopyr. So you can vary that to get some selectivity or to save money on how much herbicide you put in. And typically we see that contact herbicides have the shortest exposure time requirements. Some, like diquat, for instance, is 3 or 6 hours at a given concentration, is adequate for controlling aquatic weeds in most situations. With something like the oxinic herbicides, a longer exposure time, 18, 24, 36 hours. And then for many of the systemic herbicides, that requirement is in the context of days. For instance, with fluoridone, we find typically you need at least 2 parts per billion in the water for 60 days to get effective control. 2 parts per billion is not very much, but 60 days is a really long time. And it's particularly a long time if you're in a tidal situation. So you have to use different strategies of treatments and formulation to maintain the contact of the plant. We have found that you don't have to have it in contact continuously for that 60 hours. I'm digging a hole for myself time-wise. Let's go to some specific examples in the delta. This is for water hyacinth control. This would similarly be true for water primrose. We did 2 studies in the delta at an undisclosed location. We tested 4 herbicides. In the first test, it was at the full label rate and half label rate. And we found we could get effective control with not only the 2 currently used herbicides at that time, 2,4-D and Roundup, 2,4-D and glyphosate, but also Imazamox, Clearcast, and Gallium. The interesting thing is that with Clearcast and Gallium, the Imazamox and the Panoxylum, we're using much less herbicide. The rate is, for Clearcast, is half as much as glyphosate, and Gallium, the use rates there are 95% less. No, that's not right. It's 5% of how much you would put in for the glyphosate. So it's much, much less. And then we did a rate study with Imazamox and Panoxylum because these are not widely used for water hyacinth. You ask, well, why not? Well, because in most places in the country, money is the limiting factor. Need I say more? Anyway, next let's go on to Garrya, Brazilian waterweed. I did a trial when I first came. We used 11 active ingredients that or formulations that would most likely be used on submerged plants, 11 out of the 16. Even if they couldn't be used in this situation or in the delta. And notice that the top 4 there had better than 80% control in this scenario. It's a 12-week static exposure. And of those top 4, all but the Hydrothol 191 would be used in waters in the rest of the United States. Hydrothol 191 is not for use in waters that are for fish habitat. But I wanted to make sure I had something in there that was going to actually kill the Brazilian waterweed for a comparison. Okay, and then we can use fluridone, as was said. At the time we did this test, we could only do 500 acres of diquat in the entire delta, which is not much. And then the 4th one is a copper complex that you can use not only in the rest of the country for agaricide control, and it is widely used, but it's being used in Clifton Court to control aquatic weeds as well. It's just in the delta we can't use this because of concerns for the fish. So out of all those at the time, we could only use that one herbicide in more than 50 acres, 500 acres. Since then, we can use more diquat, which is a good thing because there are a lot of places in the delta where fluridone was just not a usable solution. Okay. And this is the problem. We have extensive water exchanges. Some data from Lars Anderson, my predecessor at the USDA, where he looked at several locations in the delta and with doing a rhodamine WT dye exchange study. And he found half-lives range from everything from 2 hours to 24 hours, depending on the location. And then the estimated washout time, how long it would take for the herbicide to wash out of the site, was anywhere from 12 hours to more than 90 hours. So you can see that at some sites, the fluridone will be much more effective because it's going to tend to stay in there, and at other sites, it's going to wash out fairly quickly. Okay, now let's start poking the bear a bit. Early in my career, yes, in the last century even, I I did a project on Onondaga Lake, which they claimed was the most polluted lake in the United States. Didn't stop me though. I jumped right in and started working. We built, this lake was vegetationless at the time. We built 3 enclosures to stop the wave action that would tend to tear up plants. And we built an enclosure to keep out common carp. And then we also planted a whole bunch of plants. And, you know, actually 8 weeks later, we came back and there was this lush aquatic plant growth, like the picture on the right there. But they weren't the species that we had planted, and they weren't in the places we had planted them. And this is what Bill Middich refers to as self-design. Okay? So we commonly see this, that the plants are going to go where they want. At that time, there was a movie called Field of Dreams, and we adopted that as our slogan for these little restoration projects in reservoirs. Build it and they will come. Yeah, I wish I didn't use this data because Jeffrey used it in his talk, but I could easily replace this with a dozen other studies where if we treat the weeds, the native plants come back. And we don't have to plant anything. That's something to keep in mind. I go ahead and plant a whole bunch of plants and see what happens. I don't mind because I don't have to do it. And then Bill Middich asked this question. All this planting we're doing, and the federal government requires it for wetland mitigation. So, there's the best reason right there. But he found he had a untreated wetland unplanted wetland and a planted wetland. This is not good replication. I know that. I'm sure he knows that too. But anyway, they're side by side. And he found that after 3 years, it really didn't matter. The planting didn't matter at all. The vegetation came back. The species came in that were appropriate for that wetland. So that's my contact information. I moved to Eads because my retirement specialist said I had to get out of California if I wanted enough money.
Thank you, John. So I want to give a brief moment here in the time we have remaining to let Tom speak a little bit about, in prior talks, we heard about the state of Washington, the Squally River situation in terms of what they're doing there. I know you've done a lot of work outside of California and obviously in this state, but are there any examples of restoration projects you've either been a part of or have been associated with tangentially that could yield us any kind of inference or concepts of what we could be doing differently here in the Delta relative to perhaps our design work as it relates to aquatic invasive plant?
Yeah, mainly we've worked on, what does this work? Here. I've been involved in various projects, I think in 13 countries in the majority of the states over the last 45 years. And a lot of times, we see these, these mitigation projects and these wetland either restoration or development projects where, and someone mentioned earlier, we always have a water depth issue with submerged aquatic plants. And it's hard to design a system to meet all requirements that you're after for fish and habitat with just dredging out a great big deep channel through the middle of it. So these things are always going to get impacted. And the key, I think, and we've even done some stuff out at, at Dutch Slough at the water primrose and the water hyacinth that came into one of the main sloughs, which just inhibited any physical movement on top of the water. So basically, you got the three things. You got four or three with the cyanobacterias, and then the floating aquatic plants, and then the submerged aquatic plants. and then from back to the whole design point, it's hard to, develop something where you can develop a project that's going to eliminate those three variables from taking over. And then we've dealt with, mechanical, which is just really, expensive. There's some new drone technologies we're playing with that we can get into, wetland areas where, we've been prohibited from accessing before, like some of the tidal marsh, Spartina stuff, along the bay or the Dutch slough type situation. But I think, what you have to do when you're putting these together is design them. It's hard to design to eliminate any type of aquatic plant or invasives from growing. But the key is up front is to, bring in or develop a program to manage, invasives right when they show up, because the longer you wait, the bigger the impact and the more impact it's going to have on fisheries and benthic organisms when you have to go in and collapse a whole colony that's taken over. So anyway.
Cool. John, do you have anything to add to that? No. Jeff? No. So one of the questions that I want to follow up on, I know we only have a few minutes left, is, thank you, is, what role does this effort of aquatic plant management have with the adaptive management framework? Where should we be considering the vegetation component when we go off and decide as a state? Because there's multiple folks here representing NGOs and all levels of government as well as citizens. Where does the aquatic invasive plant management component come in? Is it the first stage, the last stage? Because I'll be honest with you, I think we all recognize this. We are grateful for being here. We've been doing this work for 40 years, and we've been partnering with a lot of the folks in the room. But we would really be grateful to be part of this process as we evolve up front, so we can help with this effort. So any thoughts about that?
Well, I think Tom touched on it. You're going to have to manage the invasives if they're already there, if you're going to do any sort of revegetation or planting. And you're going to have to continue. I mean, the revegetation site is essentially a garden, right? And you're going to have to manage the weeds you don't want in there in your garden, in your native community, as time goes on. And at a lot of sites, for instance, if they're trying to preserve rare or threatened plants, they're managing the invasives around those so that those rare and threatened plants can continue to thrive. And in these revegetation sites, you're going to have to do the same sort of things. There are a number of examples from terrestrial restoration and from wetland restoration, and somewhat less in lakes, because planting vegetation in lakes is no fun.
Okay, so I want to allow time here to, one, thank our panel of folks. So, but I also want to open it up for questions here on the floor or online.
All right, questions in the room? All right, you were first. You're closest, all right.
So you were mentioning that through your careers, you've seen a lot of success getting rid of the non-natives and then kind of pushing the system towards the natives. But I wonder to what extent those studies also considered the non-target species, the fishes, the inverts, and how those were affected.
Generally, the projects that I was involved in, that was not a primary concern, so we were not monitoring for those components. I have been involved in a couple of herbicide dissipation studies in the past where we we monitored different organisms in cages because we wanted to collect them for residue analysis. And we did not have, significant mortality in those enclosures other than one crayfish eating the other. But so in general, no, those were not monitored by us. We were just looking at the vegetation.
Yeah, real quick, there's a lot of studies too on these various herbicides. If you're looking at the herbicide end of it, go through the registration process. There's an extensive evaluation on fish and other organisms that are living in these, the wetlands or lakes or ponds or canals. And there's a lot of good data over time on the impact of submerged aquatic invasives and floating aquatic invasives like water hyacinth on the reduction in fish habitat. Like under the cover of water hyacinth or water primrose, you'll typically see a zero dissolved oxygen level under those, so that's the fish aren't there. And then thick submerged aquatic plant beds, there's too much air cover, so the fish aren't real productive on eating each other because they can hide out and you get a stunted population. There's a lot of data on that over the last 50 years that can be accessed online.
Sure. All right, I have a two-part question on restoration design. First is, are there any tools that we can use to prevent floating vegetation like the hyacinth from getting into restoration sites?
I don't know how I would describe a gated community for aquatic restoration, but I mean, that's the only tool I can think of, and you'd have to discuss that with the Coast Guard.
But going forward is, once they move in, and Florida's been a good example of this where they, I don't know when they implemented it back in the 70s or maybe even before that, a maintenance control program, and they saw their areas, their acres treated per year go down by about 90% just from, when you see something, if it's, like a water hyacinth popping in there, a lot of times you just go pull them out because those have the capability to double every 14 days. So, once you get an acre and it gets out of hand real quick. But there's no real ways to keep it out except, like John said, blockage.
One thing I can mention real quick too is we have been working with other groups as best we can with our given resources and kind of the regulatory environment we're in for early detection and rapid response. So as John mentioned, we don't have the permissions, the tools, the resources to be able to effectively block out or gate some of these things from coming in because they're invasive species for a reason and they can outcompete what they come into contact with. But the idea between working with other groups, for example, CDFA, or SIP Fish and Wildlife, or DWR, and monitoring these and trying to have some kind of rapid response is perhaps the best that we can accomplish at this time, with hopefully being more adaptive as time goes on.
All right, thanks. I know that was a two-part question, but we're going to have to move on. Eddie, did you want to say something to close out?
All I want to say is please join us this afternoon for our breakout session, because this will be a lively discussion, most certainly. Thank you.
All right, thanks, everybody. Thanks. All right, last session before lunch. We're going to have Matt Young come up, and everybody just be a little bit patient here while we're shifting folks around.
That's still.
Is this working? Yes. Okay. Did y'all know the coffee was free? I'm well caffeinated, so we'll see how this goes. I also couldn't resist the fish pictures, so I tried as hard as I could to limit the number of fish pictures in the talk. That's why you have them up front, right? Split tail and suckers in a tidal marsh. Let's see, how's this work? So we are here today to talk to you about fish use of tidal wetlands. And I'll very much start, unlike many of the other sessions, like unfortunately I drew the short straw, so you have to listen to me for 25 minutes. Sucks to be you. But Dave Ayers is a graduate student at UC Davis. I'll go in order here, not order on the slide, but Elsie Platzer is also a grad student at UC Davis. Emma Davidson works for the CDFW Fish Restoration Program, and Brett Harvey works with DWR. And this has been we've spent a lot of time working together to think through, what story we want to tell about fish in wetlands. Because you could go any number of directions with it, and this is where we went. I will also say that I will take all blame for mistakes, for nuances that are glossed over, for anything that is mildly inaccurate. It's my fault, and any credit goes to them. This will be sort of a whirlwind look at wetlands and fish focused on the San Francisco estuary. I want to point out, and I cannot stress this enough, that there is a large body of literature in estuaries in the United States, in North America, in the world, that really drives our understanding of how fish can use these different habitats. So our understanding here does not happen in a vacuum. We wanted to start by just setting clear terms. So when we talk about fish use of tidal wetlands, we're not just talking about listed species. We're not just talking about delta smelt or salmon. We're not even just talking about native fishes, including like split tail or tule perch, but we're talking about the entire community of fishes, native, non-native, listed, not listed, and how they might use these habitats, because we can't think about any of them individually or in a vacuum. The second thing we want to define for you, or at least for the purposes of this talk, is use. So when we think about fish use of a habitat, use can mean different things to different people. And so we structure this talk in a way so that we really talk about these different uses and the benefits that fish get out of it. Oftentimes, when we think about fish use of tidal wetlands, the first thing that comes to mind is is a fish there? That's just occupancy, presence or absence. That's important, but it doesn't denote any sort of functional benefit. It's just, they swam in once and you happen to see it. Valuable, but not necessarily mechanistic. So we wound up using a paradigm that's common in stream literature, but just think of this as the 3 R's. So we can talk about use in all different ways, but today we're going to talk about refuge, so value of a habitat to avoid things like predation. Rearing, which is the value of a habitat to provide growth potential or recruitment to larger size classes. And reproduction, which is making more fish. Right? And that's ultimately what we want to see as a population level response in our listed species and other ecosystem benefits. And then finally, to go full circle and, setting expectations for the title, we're not just talking about restored wetlands today. We're talking about the range of different wetland configurations that we have in the San Francisco estuary. This includes remnant habitats, which are often referred to as reference sites, all the way through sort of passive restoration flooded islands, things that accidentally breached or intentionally breached, but there was minimal active sculpting, highly sculpted restored habitats, and then managed wetlands, which provide a really interesting insight into mechanistic function. And also these things don't exist categorically, it's a continuum, right? So every single habitat is its own thing that exists somewhere on this range. We bring all that up just so we have we're all operating under the same dictionary for the purposes of this talk. We can quibble terms all you want. That's fine, that's great. But this is what we're doing today. We are wanting to convince you of 4 things that you probably already know. So hopefully our lift isn't too heavy. But first, habitat location is key. So the actual siting of a wetland matters. The design matters. So how you sculpt, how you create, how you adjust that wetland will greatly impact function. But we don't know everything, right? That's pretty axiomatic. There's always more to learn. We're scientists, or some of us are scientists. That's, there's always more. But we know enough. And I think we know enough to start meaningfully informing some of these management questions that we need to address. We're going to go through each of these in turn. You'll see this sort of like boring thing over and over again. Oftentimes when we think about location, we think about things on the broad landscape within an estuary, right? There's this, the estuary is large. Individual habitats within that estuary will dictate which species are present. We can think about this as location affecting occupancy or presence absence just by filtering out the species pool. The amount of species that are present in the estuary, not all are found everywhere. So wherever you put it, only certain species will be there. Another way to think about location isn't just within the estuarine gradient, but having to do with access. So things like barriers or habitat ephemerality or distance from certain locations can influence accessibility of those habitats to fish. So again, we often think and we take for granted this salinity gradient that drives so much of our fish communities. But there's this access gradient where the further you are from, say, in the case of juvenile salmon, the further you are from the main migratory corridor, the harder it is for you to get somewhere, right? They just can't travel as far as we might like them to. This data is really clearly illustrated by some of the data collected by the Fish Restoration Program. So you can see here, many of the wetlands that they are studying. And longfin smelt are a perfect example of this salinity gradient. They're a brackish fish. They like salty water. They're only found downstream. That's easy, right? And then we can also think about this accessibility question in looking at where juvenile salmonids can be seen. So these little icons on the map indicate where these species were observed in 2023. So this is the recent FRP data. And you can see that actually this year, out-migrating Chinook were seen at most of these wetlands, except for the ones in sort of the interior of Suisun Marsh, furthest away from that sort of migratory corridor. These accessibility questions are going to be highly contingent on conditions. In high and low flow periods, there's just truly not a lot of kinetic energy in the system, meaning that these fish have to move further on their own. They're not getting carried by the flows into other habitats, which you might see in high outflow years like this, where salmonids can just be literally shuffled everywhere just because conditions can be different. We'll talk about location briefly, just looking at two sort of very broad examples, starting in Suisun Marsh. So this is looking at Montezuma Slough and Montezuma wetlands, so right there on the eastern side of the marsh. And some of the work recently has just demonstrated that, although there can be differences in community, generally speaking, what you see outside is what you see inside, right? You should not necessarily expect a restoration site to be immediately and obviously wildly different than the surrounding habitat, just because those are the species that are present. We see similar things up in the Cache-Slough complex if we look at two sort of adjacent but different geomorphologically, it's a word, I can get it out, distinct wetlands. Again, the dominant species inside in one or the dominant species in another. It's just a function of location. But this is where we get into design and how design can mediate some of this occupancy. Design can be very effective at just mediating the species pool. Just by changing the shape of a habitat, you can adjust which species might be present. So there was some work done looking at these adjacent habitats in the Cache-Slough complex. There's the Liberty Island Conservation Bank. It's on your left in the blue, the highly reticulate dendritic channel. And then Little Holland Tract, which is a passively restored flooded polder there in green on the right. And you can see here in the top just the overall species pool. So if you look at the center with the little T looking thing, that's the external habitat, represented 19 species. And each of those smaller habitats, those restored habitats, had a subset of that community. And if you look at the actual statistical analysis of the community, the two habitats were statistically different from each other. Again, dominated by the same species, but when it comes time to look at which species weren't most abundant, they really drove community difference across the two habitats. Perhaps this is a good time to say that this is a broad brush look at a whole bunch of different studies in a whole bunch of different ways. And so if you want any more details on any of these things, like please don't hesitate to ask one of us. This is intended to just start the conversation about fish and habitats. This is not a holistic presentation. But another way that design can mediate occupancy is just through affecting access and accessibility. So again, looking at these two habitats in the Cache Slough complex, Liberty Island Conservation Bank on the left, Little Holland Tract on the right. I'm going to rehash some of the work that Dave presented in the design talk, but with sort of a different lens or a little more detail. So the changing colors here represent the different depth categories as they fluctuate over time. You were probably all in the room earlier. Dave pointed out that depth is a fairly simple but reliable indicator of rearing habitat for salmonids. And here we can definitely see that the amount of appropriate depth habitat changes, but because of the shape of the habitat, there's not as much accessibility. So there's more rearing habitat in Little Holland Tract, but because Little Holland Tract is so large and shaped the way it is, fish have to move as much as a kilometer to access it. And that is on a single tidal cycle. So within 6 hours, they will have to travel a kilometer to get to suitable habitat, which has all sorts of implications bioenergetically, but also exposure risk. The more you move, the more likely you are to encounter predators and things of that nature. The other thing that comes out of this work is showing that in addition to movement distances and things, this shape structures movement patterns. So in a really ephemeral habitat, like an intertidal basin, like this polder, fish movement's entirely driven by the tide. They go in, they go out, right? In places that are a little bit more consistent, where tidal movement isn't as essential to maintaining your appropriate depth regime, a lot of those fish abundance patterns are instead driven by other cycles, like day-night cycles, diel cycles. And you can see fish use different habitats just based on time of day. We're going to keep moving through our uses, right? So we just talked about occupancy, fish presence. Now we're going to talk about how they actually get a benefit from the habitat. What are they doing there? And first we'll talk about design and refuge. There's been work showing that tidal wetlands are great places for fish to eat, and that includes striped bass. So striped bass are, at this point, the dominant piscivore in the system, piscivore meaning fish that eats fish or something that eats fish. And we've demonstrated that striped bass generally actually will preferentially move into tidal marshes to forage. And they'll eat a lot of fish while they're there. They'll eat bugs, they'll eat fish, they're just moving into marshes to eat. But they're not eating the same way everywhere in the marsh. So this is work done by some predation event recorders in Suisun Marsh, looking at predation rates in different habitat types within a marsh. Specifically, intertidal channels, the subtidal channels, and then the junction between the two. Overall predation rates in a tidal marsh were extremely similar to predation rates seen using this technique in other places, like in the middle of the San Joaquin River. So not functionally, different in that respect. But most of the predation, at least in this study, happened in these deeper subtidal channels or at the junctions with intertidal channels. This ties back really nicely to that evaluation of rearing habitat as a function of depth. So right now, we understand that fish movement and distribution is a function of depth, and it can have very strong relationships with predation potential. I believe there's actually a question to Dave from someone on the internets about that. So that's going to be his problem to tie it all together. And this is Dave's very, very qualified statement that habitat can, under certain circumstances, really ameliorate some of this predation risk. And our job is to really figure out how to make that happen in a realistic and meaningful way. There's been a lot of other work showing fish foraging patterns and how variable it can be within a wetland. So this is work from Denise Colombano. There's all sorts of stuff here. I'm not going to dive into it. Again, we're just getting a survey. But suffice to say that design can really impact predation risk and refuge availability for fishes. And that's not even getting into some of the more complex habitat, such as vegetation or other things that can really interfere with predator mobility. In addition to refuge, design mediates rearing. Remember, rearing here, we're just talking about growth potential or potential for recruitment to larger size classes, conferring some sort of benefit to individuals or populations. There's been work at a range of tidal wetlands all over the central estuary where par, juvenile salmonids, were placed in cages and left to grow. They're a little more complicated than that, but they stuck them in a cage, came back and saw how big they got. And there's a whole bunch of potential takeaways from this, but one of the main things that I want you to realize is just that growth potential, in this case, on the y-axis here is just like mass standardized growth per day, so how much a fish is growing, varied associated with geomorphology. So the actual shape of the wetland was predictive in illustrating how much these caged fish grew. Caged salmon growth is a function of morphology. We can argue about, cage effects and whether or not there's any, whether or not these fish were able to exhibit natural behavior, anything like that. Regardless, the point here is just that growth potential varied as a function of shape, right? Typically the highest, in this study at least, the highest potential was tied to some of these areas where there were large ponds at the end of long channels where there was an engine for productivity to get going, and then it was sort of advected, at least along the length of the channel, past those cages. Other studies have looked at different ways in which geomorphology can influence rearing benefits, confer rearing benefits. Estuaries in general, and wetlands in particular, are often referred to as like nursery habitats. And there's a lot of literature discussing like, what is a nursery? What does that mean? What kind of benefits does that include? But some work from Denise Colombano demonstrated that within Suisun Marsh, the location, the nursery potential for different species was a function both of siting within the marsh with relative proximity to upland transitional zones and marsh habitats and other additional components. So a function of location within the marsh and a function of the habitat surrounding where the fish were found. And this was species specific. Again, we're glossing over like a whole bunch of things, but the point here is that we have a better understanding now as to where and how these habitats can be made to enhance rearing and nursery potential. I'm completely glossing over a wide body of work that has been published or is ongoing. I see, looking at ISA right now, talking about tracing food to fish and actually evaluating some of these things. But we're learning. There's a lot that we've learned about this. Our third R was reproduction. I don't know. Nobody's really looking, to be quite honest. So we know that some of these species, these obligate wetland species, only really reproduce in wetlands. This is a tule perch. Think of live birth. Isn't it adorable? Oh my God. Anyway. So we know that some of these obligate wetland species definitely reproduce in these habitats. The big question is, what about other species? So there's been some recent studies showing that there are high densities of larval longfin smelt, or even milting or egg producing longfin smelt seen in some wetland habitats in both the low salinity zone and South Bay. But generally speaking, this idea of reproduction as a population benefit is not something we're really explicitly evaluating in many ways. We can quibble about that too. This really gets us to these ideas of, because we know more about design, we are able to isolate mechanisms that might be benefiting fishes. And one of the most intriguing ways to really isolate these mechanisms are in these managed wetlands, which represent sort of extremes of design. So here's just a plot showing the proportion of native fish on the y-axis. On the right, in yellow, is the slough itself, the exterior habitat. The blue is a restored wetland habitat. And then the pond represents these managed wetlands. Proportion of native fish isn't necessarily the only metric by which we should evaluate these, but it's a pretty compelling one in the sense that they very clearly are filtering that available species pool to just be native species, which is one way to think about a benefit. This plot represents, direct comparisons between Grizzly King, which is a managed wetland directly adjacent to Tule Red, which is a restored habitat right off of Grizzly Bay. And again, much higher proportions of native fish. We could talk about the species composition. Yes, we want to grow more than stickleback, but at the same time, there's a benefit, right? And a lot of this can be seen, we start getting some of these mechanistic effects that were discussed in earlier talks. I'm looking at Alice and pointing at Alice. But just, primary and secondary productivity in these habitats is high. And we can learn a lot by manipulating very specific habitat attributes and getting a sense for what that might mean mechanistically and how these habitats might add to the mosaic of available, the portfolio of mechanisms available for you or for us.
Quick time check. We have about 10 minutes left. I'll give it an extra 5.
Oh, that's good.
Okay.
We're good. We'll figure it out. Yeah. But these things include, hydro period, both seasonally, interannually. These things include residence time, how long you let water percolate on a floodplain before you bring it back in. We can learn a lot by manipulating that sort of stuff in habitats that have the infrastructure available for us to do it. This also really gets at, starts to get us at the question of trade-offs and what functions we actually want benefits to provide, right? High proportion of native fishes, high secondary productivity, those are great benefits, but they come at the cost of access, right? It's hard for smelt or salmon to get through a tidal gate. So there's trade-offs to this, and that's why any of these sort of habitat configurations needs to not exist on its own, but sited on the landscape with which it is related. Hopefully this has been a relatively convincing survey indicating that, we understand a little bit, at least, how location and design can predict use. And we're going to touch a little bit on the uncertainty part of this, right? We don't know everything, and we can dive into the scientific uncertainty with as much detail as we care to. There are many examples just for Chinook salmon. Are there preferred rearing depths? What are the trade-offs between growth potential and predation risk, right? So say those that growth potential from the cage study, some of those might be really high, have really high predation risk that would offset any benefit from growth. What is the potential or realized population benefit of these places? Do wetlands actually confer an escapement or return value to salmonids? These are things that some people are looking at, but there's a million specific questions that need to be addressed if we want to really understand all of the mechanisms. Broadly speaking, we identified these as some of the more outstanding categories. There's a lot of uncertainty as to how wetlands might ameliorate interactions between invasive species and native species? Is there a predation problem? Is there a competition problem? Is there an apparent competition problem? How do wetland benefits change over time or across ontogeny? So the benefit that a wetland confers in April to juvenile fishes is going to be different than the benefit it confers in October to subadult fishes. One of the things that's really crucial that I think we have a really poor understanding of is how these habitats fit into the landscape. Are there synergistic effects between wetlands that are sited next to each other? Are there of different configurations? These are things that we can start to maybe get at with some of the different configurations present in, like, say, Lookout or Dutch Slough, or areas that have a high concentration of habitats. But it's a really tricky question to answer, but it could be really important in helping us decide how we want to do things. And then finally, we think we know something about design, we think we know something about use, but that's all going to change, right? The seas are rising, it's getting warmer, and there's always another invasive species on the horizon. So that's where this conversation today comes in, is how do we manage and have flexibility for that? All of these are crucial if we really want to refine our understanding of wetlands from a scientific perspective. But we're here today to talk about management and the management side of things, and that's where I think we really need to, we'll be focusing the rest of the day. There's siting and design considerations, there's monitoring considerations, there's adaptation. Design for use. We think we can design for use. Darcy, how are we on time?
Not so great.
Perfect. Okay. I'm going to run through some stuff, and we'll just, I'll give short shrift to a few things, and I apologize to the relevant people. We can design for use, right? There's a whole lot. We had a whole talk on that. We can define use. We can define function. We can monitor for use, right? So right now, we are doing, I would argue, a fairly fantastic job of monitoring for occupancy in a lot of these habitats. Our monitoring isn't necessarily designed for all of the uses that these habitats could potentially provide. And that's not to say that that's a problem. It's just, we can't do everything, and so we got to figure it out. We got to prioritize. And then finally, we need to be able to adapt and manage adaptively for these different functions. We might notice that a wetland was designed for a function. It is not meeting that function. How do we adapt so that either that habitat can provide a function, or we can make a new habitat that would provide a synergistic function? Oh boy, this brings us to a lot of the uncertainty that we have in management and that we face today, right? So there's been a lot of words spent on identifying goals for wetland restoration. Are they functional goals? Are they what are they? We have a sense, I know, but we need to clearly define them before we can move forward with this adaptive management question. And then we need to really identify what that management looks like, right? Is it just design? Is it synergistic design across multiple functions? Do we have the capacity, either institutional or bureaucratic, to actually modify restoration projects after they've been implemented? How do we go about doing that? Is that possible? I would argue that if we don't have some way to do that, the idea of adaptive management is just sort of like a non-corporeal entity that we all talk about, but nobody can see, and we can't effectively adjust to changing conditions, either on the ground or in the environment. Yeah, they're fish, pretty place. I'll shut up now. Many thanks to many people who've done a whole lot of crazy great work that I inevitably got wrong today. Yeah, thank you. This is the contact information for our author team. And any questions now, or over lunch, or conversation later?
I think let's do a couple of questions now, and then Linda and I are hatching ideas. Maybe you could re-record this talk with the full set of slides, because it's really good. All right, we'll start with Louise.
Thanks for great talk, great presentation, and thanks, Matt. So my question is, I think we're all aware that there's a concern about these tidal wetland habitats being opportunity for SAB, invasive aquatic plants, and then those harboring predators. And to do that, we're supposed to build, one idea is to build deeper habitat so that we don't get those plants. But I'm also hearing from your talk and from Dave's work, deeper habitat might be where predation is higher, rates might be more likely. So are we primed for a trade-off study on what should you aim for? Should we live with some plants and some associated predators, or should we go deep and try not to have the plants?
I'll give my 2 cents and then I'll put Dave on the spot. Species will matter, right? So the predation work that was presented here was all striped bass in areas that were not necessarily highly vegetated from SAB. As largemouth are going to be a different story. So local community composition is going to matter. And then other design considerations like tidal prism. Deeper, larger places will suck up more tidal prism, which will limit or affect restoration in other places. But I'll just let Dave.
Yeah, just a quick thought on that. So thought experiment, if you had, wetlands next to each other, one was deep and one was shallow, which one would produce more food if they both produce the same amount of predation, I guess? There's trade-offs with food as well. But I think, that might require, to more directly answer your question, might require some direct field studies to look at what predation rate is like in intertidal channels with vegetation.
Which hasn't been very...
Yeah, probably needs to be redone, I would suspect.
All right, one more. Was it you, Stacy? All right.
Although I'm going to kind of cheat, it's not really a question. I know some of the slides that you slid through, and I just wanted everyone to hear about, in our data, there's a lot of nuance based on gear type and season, and it was a plug for people to work together and share data. So wanted to make sure that was heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacey. I'm sorry I had to skip that.
All right. Well, I think that's it. For folks in the room, lunch is in the back.